Speakers to the stage. Renee Tajima-Peña is an Academy Award nominated filmmaker whose work focuses on immigrant communities, race, gender, and social justice. Her credits include the documentaries Calavera Highway, Skate Manzanar, Labor Women, My America or Honk If You Love Buddha, and Who Killed Vincent Chin. Her films have premiered at the Cannes, Sundance, Toronto, and San Francisco film festivals and the Whitney Biennial. And in case you didn't hear, this film, No Más Bebés, was nominated this year for an Emmy Award for Best Historical Documentary. And she's also a professor of Asian American Studies here at UCLA. Madam President. We also have here with us, and I haven't seen her yet this evening, but Virginia Espino, are you here? Oh, great, okay. Virginia Espino is a lecturer of Chicanx and working class history at UCLA and serves on the board of California Latinas for Reproductive Justice and the Southwest Oral History Association. She earned her undergraduate degree from UC Santa Cruz and her PhD from Arizona State University, where her research focused on population control politics and reproductive injustice during the 1970s. Her essays have been published in the Chicano Studies journal Aztlan, and you can also find her collection of oral history interviews here at UCLA's Center for Oral History Research, where she spent 6 years documenting the Chicana and Chicano communities of Los Angeles. Espino was a producer and the lead historian for No Más Bebés, which was largely based on her dissertation research. Renee and Virginia are joined tonight by Maria Elena Figueroa, who is one of the real-life plaintiffs in the landmark Madrigal versus Quilligan lawsuit, and you've seen her on film here tonight. So please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Claudia, and all the team at The Hammer. This is really wonderful. Happy birthday, Virginia. Thank you. And Mrs. Figueroa, thank you so much for coming. We're just here to talk to the audience and answer questions, so please, if you're one of our students, you'll get extra credit for asking a question. Not really, but we can't see, so I guess the mic people are going to handle it. Yeah, you can make the decision.
Hi, it's a very, very moving documentary. What I wanted to ask you, because the documentary revolves around a small group of women, but at one point in time, the camera scans a very, very large list of women who obviously are not presented in the documentary, and then there is a moment where they talk about all the different states where there was this practice, and we've known also that in Puerto Rico they did it. So what is, how much of this is known? How many of these people have actually managed to sue the government or do something about it?
There's only been 2 lawsuits, to my knowledge. One was the Ralph V. Weinberger lawsuit, where the young girls who were as young as 12 were sterilized, and their mom basically signed an X on the form. That was one lawsuit that predated the Madrigal case, and then there's the Madrigal v. Quilligan lawsuit. But as far as I know, there haven't been any other lawsuits based on the American Indian experience or the Puerto Rican experience.
And this was happening all over the country. Also, U.S. foreign aid was tied to family planning programs in developing countries. So there were many sterilizations. I mean, there's contraceptive care, which was really great. It brought, contraceptive access to contraceptives to a lot of women who otherwise could not afford it. But there was this push to lower the birth rate of the poor. And if you remember that black and white government film from 1968, which was a USAID film, that was actually a film to encourage doctors to take social responsibility for population control. So it was a training film of all these different methods of sterilizations, tubal ligations, contraception, etc.
Hi, thanks a bunch for the documentary. It was amazing. When I watch things like this, I'm always shocked at a couple of things. One, I think the doctor's resolve and still thinking that what they did was right is just outrageous. But then I also think, as contemporary observers, like, hindsight is 20/20, right? Like, we can see that we knew it was wrong, even though boards of lots of people created films and training. And so just so that, you know, if you have a thought on what are contemporary issues related to reproductive justice that we can be keeping our eyes on to not get lost in the shuffle and have some of these things take place, right? Because I imagine that there was an educated audience around and students in college when all this was taking place and just wasn't seeing what was happening. So just curious if you have thoughts on current issues. Because I think a lot of times when you see these documentaries, it's like that thing that happened long ago and not bringing it back to understanding that it's something still happening right now.
Well, this is a film specifically about sterilization, but it's really a film about the larger issue is who controls my body, of women's reproductive autonomy and freedom. So I think I'm shocked at my age seeing it under attack the way it has been in the past few years. I mean, Dr. Rosenfeld, who, was really run out of town after he spoke up as the whistleblower, became an OBGYN. He left Los Angeles, he went to Detroit. He was so talented, he took his boards, OBGYN boards, and scored like first or second across the country. So he became a obstetrician, gynecologist, has had a practice in Texas for many years. He's an abortion provider. He also reverses tubal ligations. I mean, he really believes that if a woman wants to have a baby, doesn't want to have a baby, wants to control her fertility, as a doctor, he is there to provide it for her. And he's been harassed. He's in Texas. He's in the belly of the beast. But it's really, we've really taken many steps back. And even with sterilization, until a few years ago, incarcerated women in California were being sterilized in much the same way. I mean, we met some of the women. If you close your eyes, you can hear the voice of Mrs. Figueroa or of any of the other women on our film, because the stories were very, very similar.
And I'd just like to point you to the California Latinas for Reproductive Justice website, because that's a place where you can go to find out what are the contemporary issues that especially Latinas are facing in California, because they look at reproductive justice on this wide spectrum of issues that women face. So immigration can be one of them. Access to, of course, birth control is another. But also they look at the treatment of teen moms, whom they call young parents. They don't use that term teen mom. They look at the support that young parents need in order to raise their children in a healthy environment. So there's this whole range of issues that they address, and you can find out that information on their website. So those are some of the things that we are facing today. And also I think it's important to note that sometimes certain communities are targeted for these projects. So the film looks at family planning in the 1970s, but you can find other projects for the control of fertility that are focused on women of color and in certain urban centers. Planned Parenthood has a lot of its centers in some of these neighborhoods where there's primarily working class, women of color, and so that's something also to pay attention to.
Did any of those people that Dr. Rosenfeld got in touch with, like Jesse Jackson, did any of them follow up? And if
Not that
why
we're
not?
aware of,
Why
no.
do you think
He
they
wrote
didn't?
thousands of letters, hundreds of letters, probably not thousands.
So why do you think nobody followed up? Nobody cared.
Nobody cared. I mean, I think because they were women, they were Mexican immigrant women, and you know, I think one really important theme of the film, which I really got from Virginia's research. Virginia would always say, and she's written, motherhood is a political act, which I thought, oh, that sounds cool, but what the hell does she mean by that? And in making the film, I really kind of had this revelation. I understood what she meant because I came up during the whole feminist era in the 1970s. And, you know, motherhood was, women wanted to do anything other than what their mothers did, which is raise kids and, you know, get pregnant and the whole thing. And but these women really valued their children. They valued family. And having grown up in, you know, a 3-generation home of immigrants, I look back on my own childhood and my own life, and motherhood is, ain't nothing wrong with motherhood, you know. So I think that the way the women in the Madrigal 10 asserted, you know, their value of family, which was kind of against the grain of mainstream feminism, I think that was really crucial, really important.
I just want to thank you for making this film. It's really well constructed and it's a great piece of narrative. And I wanted to ask Mrs. Figueroa what it's like for you to watch this film.
It is always it touched me every time I saw it. But I know that it has done something to the woman since 1970, whatever. But you have to defend yourself. You have to do what you have to do and whatever you want to do. You have to be woman to do something. No, don't let them do that to you, because to us it was, I found out until 1975. But I don't, every time I see the doctors, the one that they were responsible, I heard. But then everybody saw the movie. Everybody listened. When you got your boyfriend, yes, know that you're going to have kids, but you wait and you have to do what you have to do to have your children.
I thought there was an interesting commentary near the middle of the movie where we saw that movements that we see as progressive and largely positive were, like the feminist movement or the Chicano movement, were largely narrated by white women and Chicano men, respectively. Is it inherent of these movements? Must they always be serving only a specific group like that?
Well, that was contemporary, or that was commonplace for the time period. You're talking about the late 1960s, early 1970s. So you had male dominance throughout society. And in the Chicano movement, you definitely had certain organizations that were male dominated, but you had women who broke away from those organizations and formed their own organizations. So as early as 72, you had some all-female organizations. The Comisión Femenil was one of them, and Gloria Molina, who's in our film, was one of the first presidents of that organization. So that happened early on. But that division between the white feminists and the Chicana feminists, that was something that was related to their own personal experience, because white women weren't struggling with people trying to control their fertility in that same respect as far as permanent fertility control. And so they were advocating for this idea of abortion on demand. That was their politic. So that's the position where they were coming from. And so when they were confronted with this idea of a waiting period, they got really nervous because they thought that waiting for sterilization was going to mean that we have to wait for an abortion. And so they really weren't going to be on board with that. And that's still controversial today, where we have some activists trying to overturn this waiting period for sterilization. And in actuality, it is being applied to abortion in some states. California is a utopia in that respect. So those are historical debates, and sometimes they seep into the present. But there's a lot of coalition work happening today that I'm really excited to be a part of.
Yeah, I just want to add, I think it's the failure of looking beyond your own interests, because in this case, you know, any of the women could have been asked if they wanted to be sterile, and they were asked when they had prenatal care, you know, during their pregnancy. But when they went to the hospital in labor, they were all there for emergency C-sections. That meant that their pregnancy, the child was in crises. The pregnancy was in crises. So they were hemorrhaging, or, you know, they were worried that their babies would die. They were often medicated. You know, and that is not, and if you've ever been in labor, it hurts and it's exhausting. And it's not the time to ask somebody, do you want to be permanently sterilized at that time? So this question of, you know, a 3-day waiting period, and, you know, I'm a middle-class woman, what does that have to do with me? And, you know, I don't want to see it happen. It's like I said, it's really a failure of seeing beyond yourself.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Isabel Castro, and I'm the artist that produced the series Women Under Fire that's part of the Radical Women's Exhibition. So I want to thank everybody for being here. The film and everything that a lot of you experienced tonight were exactly some of the same sentiments and feelings that I had after graduating from art school, and that's what propelled me to produce this series. And I just want to thank everybody here. This was a conversation that I wanted to have soon after I graduated and produced the series, and there was nobody to have the conversation with. So I'm very grateful to all of you for sharing this moment, sharing just the dialogue about respecting life, period. And I wanted to thank and acknowledge also Cecilia and the curators at the Hammer for providing such a tremendous platform for this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your work.
Hi, I have a question for Senora Figueroa. In hearing that laws were passed for this forced sterilization to not continue, were you able to feel some sort of closure in hearing that other women wouldn't have to experience the horrific thing that you had to go through?
I have learned the woman has to defend herself. I don't know if they have done it at this time, but I know that everybody knows the movie, and talk to these two women that there has to be a power, so a thing that you have to do to save your baby. And if you want to have 1 or 2 or 3, you have to think about it so that you can have it. And everything, I don't know if they still do it, but you have to do it. Okay?
Hi, my name is Brian Nguyen. I'm actually a physician, OBGYN at LA County Medical Center. Number one, I wanted to say thank you for this work, because having brought this to my attention years ago has very much impacted the way that I practice. I'm an educator at USC, and the idea of preservation of women's autonomy infiltrates the entire consciousness of everything that I do. And it is the message that I want to pass on to all of my trainees. I have one here with me today, Dr. Stephanie Wright, and we are both very proud of the work that we do. We work very hard to ensure that women do not have their autonomy violated. We work very hard to ensure that informed consent is provided in any language that a woman needs, and we've allowed these issues of reproductive coercion to be extrapolated to many other ways that women are cared for. Whether that be birth control, whether that be a woman's first exam, or any number of decisions. But it certainly has made a huge impact, and I want to let you know what it's done.
Thank you.
You know, to hear that from Dr. Nguyen, he's at LA County in the OBGYN. We did a screening in San Diego, and there was a woman, like after the films, weeping in the audience, and she stood up and she said that, and this is just to give you a sense of how things have changed for the better. Her first job was at LA County Hospital. She was 14 years old. She grew up in the neighborhood. She was bilingual. She was a Latina, like, teenager, 14-year-old. That's the same age as your daughter, Lulu, who's here. And Luna. And she said she realized that the impact of, at 14 years old, she was tasked with getting the consents from women for the sterilizations. And at 14, she had, she's just learning about reproduction and sex. She had no idea what a tubal ligation was. The women were confused. And she said to us, I realize now how little respect that the doctors and the nurses and the medical staff had for these women, that they would task a 14-year-old to get a consent for such a life-changing procedure. So it's heartening to hear that, 40 years later, things are changing, and there are people like you practicing and teaching.
That's been, for me, one of the unintended consequences or repercussions of this film, is actually impacting the medical community. We've done several screenings for medical schools, and we've had conversations with medical students, and so it's just wonderful to have you here. Thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing this work with your medical community.
Hi, I just have a quick question. At one point in the movie, Dr. Quilligan makes a comment to somebody else that they're getting a grant to stop, to affect the population. But was there evidence of that grant? Was that ever explored? Was he getting money, basically? Was USC getting money?
Definitely. It was a program under the Nixon administration, specifically to deal with the population explosion that they believed was occurring at that time. And so it was the first time that federal funds were used for family planning. Prior to that, the Catholic Church was strongly against any federal funds being used for birth control. So that policy changed, and this money was being invested into this idea that we need to provide this access for working class, lower income communities. So we do know that hospitals received funds from the federal government for family planning, but we could never find the direct paper trail from when the funds reached the LA County Hospital to the point that they were then transferred into these sterilization procedures. We do know that they were free services that were given to, supposedly given to the women who were offered them, so that the impetus was to push these procedures on the women because no one was going to really pay for them, except for the taxpayers, of course. But the hospital wasn't going to be paying for them. And at the same time, the medical students were receiving surgical experience. So it was like two wins for these procedures, unfortunately, for the women who entered the hospital for these emergency deliveries. But we never found any paper trail that really pinned, for example, one procedure with the money, but we know that they received funds for family planning.
There's some evidence that we, shot some documents of grants that were given to public hospitals across the country that was in there, and some newspaper clippings of grants that were given to the hospital for family planning programs, but that kind of specific paper trail we never found. And we also found the USAID money, which was strange. So the LA County Hospital was getting money from the U.S. Agency for International Development, and we can never figure out why. So if there's a researcher there in the audience, if you can find out, let us know. People in the front.
Hi, for Renee. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what it's like to interview some of the doctors where, from our perspective, it's like, how do you not see the, the moral implications of this? And I think it was kind of similar with Who Killed Vincent Chin, where you get people to kind of open up and talk, and maybe if you can just talk about what that experience is like.
Well, if you're a filmmaker or a journalist, it's like The Get. You have the primary person on camera. So that's one thing. But then also, I really want to know is going on inside their heads. I mean, when you referred to Who Killed Vincent Chin, this was a story of a Chinese American who was killed by a white Chrysler worker during the auto recession in Detroit. And I interviewed the killer. I want to know why he killed Vincent Chin. What was going on inside his head. I also want to know from the doctors, because I think that there's different shades of gray and different levels of accountability. As a filmmaker, I'm never really interested in kind of posing the good guy and the bad guy. I think that when you do that, you kind of lose sight of the systemic context for why things happen, and also how we all are culpable in a way, in these systems persisting, these attitudes, and that kind of Elena Gutierrez talks about this perfect storm of attitudes towards immigrants, towards poor people, working people, money for family planning, which was a good program, but open to abuse, and all these kind of different layers that resulted in some cases in these kind of horrific violations of these individual women. But you only get that if you talk to everybody. I don't think you get that if you just talk to one side. And usually the audience knows, well, I'm not getting the whole story anyway. So I think to create a legitimate film, you really have to talk to all sides.
Hello. I always wanted to know, were you able to reach out to all 10 of the women, or were some of them lost in the shuffle?
This is Mrs. Figueroa's daughter. Thank you for being here and for bringing your mom to the screening. So a couple of the women sadly had passed away before we started filming. And there was one who never responded to our phone calls or our attempts to reach out, and then one who flatly did not want to participate. She had just lost her husband, and she was just in a very deep depression, and she didn't want to go on camera for us. But those that were, of the 10, we were able to interview, 4? And then one, Melvina Hernandez, she's from a different lawsuit. She's not actually part of the Madrigal case, but she's part of that same group of women who was sterilized during that period.
We interviewed 6 women.
6?
Yeah, 6, yeah. And I must say that they were very reluctant to go on camera, to participate in the film. They really fell in love with Virginia. I wish I can say they fell in love with me, but no, it was Virginia, really. And the other thing, I'm not sure if Berta, if this was... Yeah, so I think Berta and most of the kids had no idea what happened to their mothers when we approached the mothers about the film. And most of the plaintiffs who, they were reluctant to go on camera, but they asked their kids, who were at that time, of course, grown. And for the kids, it was really interesting because I think I'm not sure if this was your experience, but many of them knew that there was something horrible in the family history. They knew there were no more babies at a certain point, but that's it. And when we approached them about the film and the mothers had to explain what happened to them, they were really proud that their mothers had stood up, and they stood up to, they sued the doctors, the county hospital, the state of California, and the federal government of the United States of America. I mean, they sued everybody. And when you think about it, at that time, they were, as working class Mexican immigrant women, they were like at the bottom of the Los Angeles social hierarchy. Los Angeles at that time was, basically a white male bastion. Everything, the legal system, the healthcare system, journalism, everything. And so I think the kids, they said they were so proud. They wanted their mothers to tell the world what they had done to stand up.
Hello. I guess the question that I had was at the end of the Madrigal versus Quilligan lawsuit. It said that the conclusion of the judge was that there was a cultural deficiency kind of thing that didn't allow them to to properly give informed consent, and that made me remind of cultural deficiency theory in Chicano studies, which is like they say that Chicano students are doing bad in school because of cultural deficiencies at home, that it's not allowing them to do well in school. They're not assimilated properly enough, and I guess that kind of showed me the general view within society that the vulnerable and that the people that are poor and minorities, that it's kind of the onus falls on them. It's their fault that that they were exploited. And I guess just that question, my question comes down to is how can we combat that view that that the vulnerable, that it's their fault kind of thing.
Well, I grew up during that period, and so I grew up not knowing my language or my culture, because my parents came of age in the 40s and 50s at a time when racism was even more intense than the 60s and the period that we're talking about. So my parents really embraced this idea that if they stripped themselves of their Mexican identity, then their children would have a brighter future if they were able to assimilate. But when you look like me, you don't assimilate very easily. Even though I didn't speak Spanish and we didn't have all of the, these beautiful, wonderful trappings of our Mexican culture, I still experienced so much racism based on those notions, because it's not difficult to see the way your community is treated when you come of age at a time when you have things like the Frito Bandito on television or Cisco Kid, and you don't see anybody who looks like you anywhere. So I feel like I'm a product of the Chicano movement, making this film, educating people about what happened to Mrs. Figueroa and the other plaintiffs is part of combating that, talking about these issues, trying to create a culture shift so that we see these beautiful families that have been created, and try to understand there are many ways to have a family. There's not just one way to be a family, and that you can value your family in a way that other people might value their college degree or their Mercedes-Benz or their house on the beach. You know, there's all these different ways to love the things that you are and that you bring to society. And so hopefully through this film, we show that. So that's one way of combating that.
Hi, ladies. Thank you for being here. Last summer at the National Leadership Convention for Gates Millennium Scholars and HSF Scholars, I had the privilege of meeting Antonia Hernandez, and everything she stood for resonated with me as a pre-law student. I remember when she was talking, I was crying the whole time. Nobody, like no other guest speaker has ever resonated with me like that. So my question for Ms. Figueroa is, how did it feel to have such an empowering, fiery Chicana representing you in court?
Great. Great. Great, because we needed it. That's all I can take because it's too much.
So, well, since you brought up Antonia, it's the one thing, I mean, we couldn't really put it in the film, but she actually grew up in the neighborhood. She immigrated when she was 7 years old. She grew up in the projects right near the hospital. And, you know, as she said in the film, she was one of, I think, 6 kids. Her youngest sister was born at LA County Hospital at the same time. Charles Navarrete was from Pomona. He was like a local kid. Frank Cruz, the journalist. Antonia became the head of MALDEF, president of MALDEF, is now the CEO of the California Community Foundation. Charles Navarrete is now a judge. Frank Cruz, who was the first Latino anchor on Los Angeles television, became the co-founder of Telemundo and was the 2-time chair of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Gloria Molina, as you know, became the chair of the County Board of Supervisors, was the first in many different political offices. It's really, for me, it was really fascinating that it was this community as it was becoming during the 1970s, and all these young people, and I think they were so emotionally scarred by the outcome. It's because they felt, in a very emotional, personal way, very close to Mrs. Figueroa and all the other mothers. I mean, because they saw their own mothers in all these women.
First of all, I want to say thank you, Ms. Figueroa, for being here, for being a part of the film, and for showing us that no matter where we come from, what our backgrounds are, we have the power to fight for what is right, and that we all have the right to choose what we want to do with our lives as a woman and as a human being. We all have the same rights, so thank you. And to you, professors, thank you for making this film. And my question is for Dr. Espino. What inspired you to begin your research on reproductive justice, and where did the idea, for both of you ladies, where did the idea to do this film come from? How did it initially begin?
Well, the first question, I learned about this case when I was an adult in graduate school. So I grew up in Los Angeles. I'm from Los Angeles. My grandmother lived about 5 minutes from the LA County Hospital. And I worked, after I graduated with my undergraduate degree, I worked at Bridge Street Elementary, which is right down the street from the hospital. So I'm very familiar with this hospital. But I was not familiar with this story, and when I learned about it, I was so angry that it wasn't part of our collective memory, that these kinds of stories kind of get lost to history. And so I wanted to ensure that the Madrigal v. Killigan case would become as familiar as other important lawsuits like the Brown versus Board of Education, or well, I can't think of any right now, but I wanted you to be on the tip of your tongue, especially if you live in Los Angeles. And so I just got lucky by meeting Renee just by chance, because we both had young children that we wanted to get together to play together. So it was actually during a play date that we started talking about our work and how wonderful it would be to make a film out of it, because I was really interested in history, but also interested in the public aspect of history and how do you bring these important narratives to a wide audience. I wasn't interested in sharing my work just purely with other academics. I really wanted to share this research with as many people as possible, because I think this narrative is not simply a LA story, it's a US story.
And these stories are only told because of ethnic studies, really. Chicano studies, I teach Asian American studies. Virginia teaches Chicano studies. It's really, that's what keeps the story circulating. That's where the research is really coming from. The one person I forgot to mention was Carlos, who was, the expert witness. He was at UCLA in the anthropology department in the 1970s. At that time, the first Mexican, American or Mexican ethnicity to be hired in the anthropology department. And he really paid a price for working on this case on behalf of the plaintiffs. He was attacked for doing activist research in his department. He was like, one of the only people of color in the department. He was pre-tenure. He had, as he said, he had just gotten back from Vietnam. He saw combat. He had PTSD. He recognized the symptoms of PTSD in the women he was interviewing, and he was very close to them, really cared also about, what happened to them. He also was like a local kid. So he paid a big price. He now is, runs the Transborder Institute at ASU. So he's gone on to a real, strong career in ethnic studies. But those are all like the pioneers who really made a lot of these. I mean, as a filmmaker, makes our jobs very easy because they've really done, like Virginia, they've done the seminal research. And, during years and years and years where nobody would listen. And in the academy, nobody was listening either. So I think it's really important. So ethnic studies, take the classes.
Yeah, I had a question about the effect of the lawsuit. I know in the film it showed the plaintiffs losing because the judge said that Latinos were this subculture that the doctors couldn't possibly understand, and so they weren't liable. And it seemed to me like after such a high-profile case on this issue, that they could no longer make this argument in the future, that it was, that the effect of non-consensual sterilization, it was unknown and mysterious. And is that what happened? Did you find that even though in your research that even though they were not successful in court, that the lawsuit itself put a stop to this?
It was the lawsuit, but also the publicity that alerted people to what was going on. It's the first time that a story like this made the front page of the LA Times, where you actually have a large public hospital being publicly shamed for their practices. But the problem is the devaluation of certain kinds of mothers, and that hasn't gone away. That still exists today. Certain mothers are viewed as unfit. Certain communities are viewed as burdens to the society. And so as long as you still have those ideas, I think we're always going to have these kinds of threats to reproductive freedom. Like Renee mentioned, there were women who were recently sterilized in the prison system. And you have some legislators advocating for sterilization in exchange for freedom. for those who are incarcerated, or for public assistance. So though it just plays out differently, it really depends on what the conversation is and what the historical moment is. So I think we definitely all need to be vigilant.
Can I ask a question? Did they feel that they could not appeal that decision? Was there?
No, it was appealed. MALDEF mounted an appeal. They lost the appeal. I think it's the, the kind of legal strategy was to connect individual culpability of the doctors. They actually, but they did win. They were victorious in the suit against the federal government and the state of California. There was no compensation to the individual plaintiffs, but California and the federal government agreed to institute these reforms where there were, translated consent forms. People would get counseling. There was a waiting period, etc. So they prevailed in that bigger kind of realm. But the individual women, and suing individual doctors, it didn't happen. And I think it's because, it's systemic. It was systemic. Some of those doctors were culpable. Some of them maybe just, had got a consent form, and when they started their shift, somebody handed them a consent form, and they thought this woman wanted to be sterilized. So I think it was very hard to kind of pinpoint it to any individual doctor. And then once Dr. Quilligan, was out of the case, it kind of pulled a linchpin out of the case. Wow.
Just curious, have any of the doctors or the other defendants watched this film?
I would think so. We haven't heard from anybody. Yeah. Nobody's called us to say they enjoyed the film. No, thank God. Yeah, we were very careful because we know that they spend a lot of time in court for other reasons. Yeah.
Dr. Bernard Rosenfeld has seen it, though.
Oh, yeah, he's come to a lot of screenings. Yeah.
He's very proud.
Came to the Emmys. Yeah. He's a real kind of unsung champion. He's pretty amazing.
A couple of things should be noted as far as it being white women that were objecting to it. I think it was also a question of class, since there was a great debate within the various feminist organizations, particularly now, about this, including the one who wrote the blue pamphlet that comes in the thing. It's a question of, definitely was a question of class, of social class, and most of the people in that were advocating against sterilization being raised were middle class and also wanted to have a strategy of getting friendly politicians elected time and time again, which brings up the question nowadays. We have a incumbent president who is anti-abortion and a incumbent vice president even more so. But one of these things that was on the map of the 12 states that were doing the same thing was Georgia, which at that time had a governor and a major medical center called Grady, literally within a walking distance of the State House, that was doing the same thing. And that the problem was brought up to the governor's attention, who did absolutely nothing about it. The governor at the time was the guy who has a trademark on the word human rights, also known as later President Peanuts. So the idea of trying to get a friendly legislatures into office to change things, I think that alone would disprove it. To bring it up to modern day, there's been a case of which a minor who is detained in an immigration holding facility was denied the right to an abortion, and then got an injunction from the judge, and there's been a back and forth. Can you go on over that case and the implications of that case?
I haven't been following the news the last 48 hours, so I'm not sure of any new developments, but I do know that she's in detention on the border and being denied. She wants to receive that procedure, and she's been denied that, but after that, I don't know. So maybe there's someone else here who might have more information about the latest developments.
I think somebody in the front.
I guess I wanted to ask about the evidence, the huge pile of evidence that he had, and why maybe it was used a lot in the case, but in the film you didn't really show much of it, just little snippets of the racism of the doctors and the long list. Can you tell us more about some of the hard evidence you had and your choice of showing that in the film and not really showing much of it?
I think, in terms of the narrative, we were trying to balance the lives of the women, the plaintiffs, with the trial itself. The evidence is, we showed it visually. I mean, what you saw on Dr. Rosenfeld's dining table was just, he would write medical records on literally the back of a napkin or back of a prescription form. He would sneak into the records office to try to figure out, which women he might have been coercively sterilized. But, the evidence itself it's a little boring, I guess. Maybe from a filmmaker's point of view, maybe that's why we didn't, go into a lot of the kind of the way you would do it in a journalistic film. But, go to the website. We have some, our archive. Chicano Studies Research Center at UCLA has the whole archive, and Carlos's archive as well. So, a lot exists there. Should we wrap it up, or we're happy to take more questions or liberate you, or. Oh, thank you. Hector wants to go home. Thank you.